See, I agree with everything Nick said, except for the word irreparably. I think that if you remember, he said irreparably when he was talking about the way we're privileging a sort of fact-based testing paradigm. But in fact, I'd just like to point out that it's not that the school bureaucracies are rigid, it's that they tend to be underfunded, and they tend to have to scramble as fast as they can, especially public schools, to where the money is. And I actually think that in a functioning democracy, who we elect ends up having an influence on the policies that trickle down to where the money flows and what carrots and what sticks are there. And I think we're at a time now when we're seeing a change away from an experiment that maybe didn't work so well in applying a stick and withholding money, which took away from certain aspects of education that have been part of the school system. And you know, things go in and out based on where the resources are. So I think the schools themselves they can be flexible if they're incentivized properly. So that was just answering the word irreparably. I can do that on every word he said, but it would take too long. I'll just stop at one. All right, so let's see. I've been working for the last 4 or 5 years with Mary Flanagan. She's at Hunter and I'm at NYU in the computer science department. And we've been working with Jan Ploss, who is our education department at NYU. And what we've been focusing on, in fact, is not only making games that encourage underrepresented groups, for example, girls in programming and science, their interest at certain age groups, say 11 to 14, tends to drop off precipitously. It's really important to understand why, because you don't want to lose a big chunk of the workforce and have people suddenly find out much later, darn, I really should have done something wonderful. But we're also, a lot of what we do goes into trying to figure out how to create assessments. You could argue that the science of this project is mostly in trying to figure out what can you say, what can you prove, or what can you give convincing demonstrations of. And again, it becomes political, because if you can show clearly this works, this doesn't work, here's a controlled study, then you can actually start getting funding going through Congress. And if you just say, I think games are fun and games are cool, there are other people who are saying, no, I think they're not fun and they're not cool. So it's really important to be able to back up your forays into this by very carefully making sure you can demonstrate things and show why you really are. So I'll stop there.
Okay. Can you give a specific example in something in Rapunzel that you think represents a learning moment that has a demonstrable kind of assessment component attached to it?
In our project, yeah, kids are playing these games, and the actual game mechanic is putting together programs. So we give them a GUI to make it easier to put together programs, but everything they do is piecing together conditional statements, assignment statements, little procedures, and we can, in our assessment tool, we can see whether they have started effectively using more interesting data structures and more interesting operations. Like, were they able to get their character to be more effective by, for example, saying, oh, I see, if I use a conditional statement here, then the character starts being able to get through the game more, as opposed to, you know, some method of brute force, which is not learning the concept. So we have everything instrumented that way. I actually think, you know, I don't want to actually particularly plug our work. I think that the best thing that I've seen so far was a very clever thing that Randy Pausch and his people set up with the Alice Project at CMU, where at the high school, in terms of convincing arguments, where they had 2 groups of students each take first level computer science, and then they had one of those students use the Alice Project to do basically putting together little toy programs the year before. And they discovered that just being exposed to computer programming as a game in a very visual, simple way caused those students the next year to have a much higher degree of getting through the course without dropping out, and also they got much higher scores, and it was a really big difference. So there is an example where they just used exposing you to the topic motivationally as their approach, and they were very careful to keep track of the numbers. And that sends a clear signal that, you know, this is actually doing something.
Sure. So I'm going to just push you a little bit. Someone asked a question about the differences between games and interactive media, and was there something specific about game? And I'm just going to push on this a little because Alice is not a game, right? Do you guys know Alice, the Alice Project? Okay, so this is something that's worth looking at. The Alice Project has been produced through Carnegie Mellon, and it's basically a software platform that uses visual programming, sort of drag and drop interface, where kids can develop interactive pieces of code and really create stories. They can also create games in this medium. And Maxis recently gave them their Sims 2 library, which is now in the tool. And it allows kids very quickly to be able to build interactive narratives, to build games, to build visual things via programming. And the argument with Alice is it was also a recruitment tool to get more women into computer science and engineering. And one thing that Alice does as well as Rapunzel is it builds on something that we know that games do well, which is they situate learning, right? So one reason you learn to do things in games is that you're in a context where knowing what to do at that moment really makes sense. And Alice and Rapunzel also situate the learning of programming because you're literally building little pieces of code, and then you can see the thing do it on screen. And that's one huge value. So I'm just wondering, Rapunzel's a game. Are there things that gameness brings to the teaching of programming that you think, again, Alice you can make games with it, but it's not a game. Yeah.